Hello, and welcome back to the Purple Chair podcast, the podcast by youth for youth on how we end FGM and gender-based violence. I'm your host, Sherifat Adani, and in this episode, we will talk about intersectionality and FGM. So you may be wondering, what is intersectionality? To me, intersectionality is the way in which different forms of oppression and discrimination interact with each other. These different forms of oppression often are based on people's social groups and characteristics, such as their race, their class, ability, religion, sexuality, and gender, and how these different forms of discrimination overlap. So, in terms of how and why this is important, it is especially important to recognise people's lived experiences as different forms of discrimination interact with each other. And an example of this is a person who wears hijab, specifically a woman. So the different forms of discrimination they may face in terms of Islamophobia based on them wearing a hijab, as well as their gender, facing sexism, and potentially also racism if they are a person of colour. So how all of these different discriminations interact with each other and impact their lived experience. I first heard the term intersectionality, I believe, when I was at university, and I'm sure it was when I was studying economics. And I think it really perfectly summed up just the way in which I felt different, and also the way I perceived other people being different from myself. Again, whether visually or some of their more invisible identities. And I think it also made me think about the way in which there are just so many nuances when talking about a system or talking about the way in which people receive things. If I stood next to somebody that looked exactly like myself, although we definitely do share some identities and therefore will share certain experiences of oppression, there are definitely more things that maybe don't meet the eye, but do impact the way we do experience the world. So I could use my own lived experience here as an example of intersectionality. I am a black woman who wears hijab. So being someone that is black, I face racism. Being a woman, I face sexism. And as a Muslim who is visibly Muslim, I also face Islamophobia. The way in which these identities sometimes interact is, for example, moving through the world and people feeling entitled to make comments on the way I present. Often that is very heavily rooted in sexism. People feeling entitled to have an opinion on one's body or the way they choose to present. Also, Islamophobia in the sense of the hijab being vilified, and generally people who decide to dress modestly as well. And also racism in the way in which people, again, feel entitled to make comments or just have stereotypical preconceptions on me as a person. So intersectionality to me is very, very important, as it really does capture my lived experience and how I move through the world, as I am multiple different things at once. And I hold all of these identities and they interact with each other. So it's a great way to really gain an insight into my own lived experience as well as others. Intersectionality is a very useful lens to think about when discussing FGM, because it really brings to the forefront the fact that survivors often have multiple identities and experience multiple forms of discrimination at the same time. I would say that survivors of FGM and people who are affected by the practice often face multiple forms of discrimination other than sexism. So, for example, many of them belong to an ethnic minority and experience obvious and less obvious forms of racism. when I was speaking to somebody about FGM, and we were especially talking about how certain midwives and other like practitioners don't know much about the practice. And I don't remember if this woman even knew she had it done, or even knew how different her vagina looked than somebody else's. So when she actually went in for some form of examination, the person who was actually looking at her audibly screamed. And not only that, but then kind of started spewing some of the stereotypes they had heard about people that belonged to her ethnic group. That person was affected by that nurse's reaction, as they were entirely deterred from seeking support, seeking help for a very long time. They didn't want to interact with the healthcare system at all. And I can imagine someone being affected also in their intimate life as well through that interaction, and also just through the way they perceive their own body, and looking in the mirror and just kind of internalizing that all. There is a lot of racial stigma attached to FGM and the way in which it's spoken about and perceived by people. A personal anecdote is when talking about my activism to people, and some of the responses I've heard a lot around them not knowing that it happens to people that look like myself, who are West African, or specifically for myself, who are from Nigeria, and purely associating the practice with certain regions of Africa, and then offloading certain stereotypes about those regions of Africa, whether it's, again, the ethnicity, also the religion they practice, and just other harmful stigmas as well. I have another example where a woman went into her local, either it was a general practitioner or hospital, some sort of health environment, and she was trying to set herself an appointment as she was having some issues with her periods, and she had quite a thick accent, and she faced a lot of discrimination even when speaking to the receptionist, where they said they didn't understand what she was saying. They were super dismissive of just the fact that she had any pain. They didn't provide her even the option of a translator, or even to just like ask her to slow down or repeat. They just dismissed her as soon as they heard her accent. And as a result of that, they also didn't believe that she had any form of citizenship or had any secure migration status. So also projected the idea that, oh, you have this accent and you look the way you do, so I'm going to perceive that you're not only quote unquote not from here, but are not entitled to this service. And then she also started to make assumptions around why she might be in the GP. So she was just like, oh, you're having a problem with whatever, or you people always come to the GP related to X, Y, and Z reasons. So yeah, it was very, what's that? It was very off-putting for her to return to the GP firstly, or any medical institute, and seek help. People who are affected by FGM and people who are survivors of FGM often face different forms of discrimination. A lot of people who are survivors of FGM who are based in Europe, for example, often belong to ethnic minority groups, so often experience forms of racism, whether obvious or less obvious forms. Racism in the healthcare industry often impacts the way that survivors are able to interact with it. So often, for example, survivors may be put off from seeking support within the system. And an example of why is preconceived notions of certain groups of women being able to deal with pain differently than white women. Black women in the health industry are often considered to be able to withstand a greater amount of pain, and also are not always believed when they raise concerns around their pain levels or just their bodies in general. This is evident through a study that shows that Black women are less likely than white women to be offered pain medicine or relief while in a hospital. At times, it has been pretty exhausting doing activism in this space. I think especially in Europe, some of the preconceived notions of what an FGM survivor looks like, and the stigmas related to each of their identities and experiences, presuming that survivors or people who are affected either look a certain way or have other identities that are not visible. People who are affected by FGM are extremely diverse. As a result of this, it's important to think about intersectionality to really capture their differences and the different identities that may be interacting with each other when they are moving through the world. For example, this podcast series, we have a range of people who have spoken, and many of us are affected by FGM, and we have various similarities, but more importantly, various differences too. For example, some of us are Muslim, some of us are not, some of us are Black, and some of us are not. In addition to this, we have varying abilities, and we also just have generally different lived experiences. We speak different languages, and we belong to different ethnic groups. As a result of this, we all move through the world in different ways, and because of that, we experience the world differently and experience different forms of oppression. Sometimes online, reading discourse around FGM and hearing certain assumptions around survivors and their communities as well, hearing assumptions around the religion they must be, and then following up with disparaging things about their faith. So, for example, kind of going on like a Islamophobic tirade of this is not just a cultural practice, but then associating it with the religion, and then going into how said religion is not only harmful, but also in many ways, quote unquote, backwards. I think that stigma causes us to not really look at the issue in a holistic light, so not see certain forms of discrimination and how they all feed into the way in which survivors move through the world and how this differs per person. It also makes, for example, with like policy or maybe support services, they're very tailored to fit a certain type of person versus serving just a wider community or wider set of affected people. If I were to be speaking to somebody who had decision-making power when it comes to policies, I think I would start with telling them that just like any room of people, FGM survivors have their differences, and to really adequately support them, we do need to think about the ways in which they differ and tailoring policies and support and any other form of service to meet those differences and really capture the way in which, as humans, inherently we're different and we all need different things. Now, to further enrich our perspective, I'd like to bring in two of my close friends talking about their personal experience as people with multiple sides to their identities and how intersectionality impacts the way they move through the world.
I'd say my intersectional identity is compromised of being a young Muslim woman from London, of Algerian origin, and with French nationality. Each of my identities, I'd say, shape me and how I navigate the world in different ways. Being born and raised in London was such a melting pot of different cultures and religions and traditions, and it was a really unique experience going to school and being raised in London, and I would say that forms the core of my identity because that's all I really know, to be honest. And with my Algerian identity, I think it's a blend of Berber influence and city influence, as well as some French influence. Additionally, my mum's a French national and was born and raised in France. And I think that forms quite a big part of her identity as a Muslim French woman of Algerian origin. And because it significantly influenced her, I think it consequently shapes some aspects of my own identity. While I don't really identify as French, more so just Algerian French, I guess. I know the Arab influence and the North African influence in France is, or the North African experience in France is quite a unique experience, so I identify to a lot of that. I think despite the different or the diverse elements of my identity, I don't feel fragmented or detached from any part of myself. I used to, but now I just embrace the richness of the complexity of my different identities. I really like that it allows me to relate to a lot of different scenarios and peoples and contexts and histories, and I think the intricate blend of identities is a source of strength, and it helps me empathize and understand with a lot of different individuals and different aspects of the world. I appreciate having different facets that I can draw from. For example, oftentimes I'll relate to art from London or the music scene in London, and then sometimes, like if I'm watching a French movie portraying the Arab or African experience in growing up in Paris, I'll relate to that. So I don't think it's a matter of feeling removed or lacking in any identity. I think it just feels like I'm part of a intricate, unique journey, and my identity just becomes a source of connection, in a way. In different places I've noticed that society receives my various identities in different ways. I think I can be a bit ethnically ambiguous, so people guess I might be from like Turkey or North Africa or South America or Turkish or like a range of different things. But growing up in London in a really diverse area and going to a multicultural, multi-faith school, my identity and intersectionality weren't ever a big deal. I was just a Muslim Algerian girl and my friends were from Nigeria or Jamaica or Guyana or Poland or Albania or wherever, and in the end we were just friends and we were all just kids from London. And then I left London for university in Norwich, and that's when I found I was perceived quite differently. Suddenly I wasn't just a Londoner or like just, myself really. I was seen as other or not English or brown, as I was called quite a few times. It was the first time I really struggled with my intersectionality. I found myself questioning where I fit in or feeling forced to identify in ways that made other people feel comfortable. Leaving London for university in Norwich was definitely a culture shock for me because I found myself in a predominantly white university and course. I didn't feel like I fit in there, or I was made to feel like I was other, so I didn't feel like I fit in, and on top of that, I didn't quite find my place in cultural societies either. I think being North African, I didn't really feel Arab, so I didn't feel like I fit into the Arab society, or because I wasn't black, I didn't feel like I fit into Afro-Caribbean society. So yeah, I mean, I got along with everybody, but I never quite felt like I found my fit. Yeah, and I felt like this constant struggle to fit into like a predetermined category, and a lot of the time it did make me feel less than. And I think looking back at it now, it's all because of how people perceive my identity and not because of how I perceive my identity. I just felt like I wasn't English or white enough for some and not Arab enough for others and not French enough for people who wanted me to fit into that box. And yeah, it was a bit of a tough time feeling like I was being forced into one thing while not fully belonging anywhere. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of the time it made me feel like an outsider, even when I was surrounded by people that I did get along with. I think in London there are so many different boxes and everyone's so used to that, so it feels less rigid. But once you step outside, it's like there's this binary, you're either this or that, or you're in the white box or the not white box, and that's it. And it made me realize how much people, yeah, just crave. I think people are more comfortable categorizing others, or knowing that they can categorize you and have assumptions about you. Yeah, I think generally I don't really have a problem with my intersectional identity. It only became a problem when I was being questioned or made fit into one box that just didn't fit.
So in my experience, being Black, British, Muslim woman in the education sector, alhamdulillah, I can't complain. I don't think I have really had a hard time navigating that space. I think actually, for context, I went to university in Wales. I think they really embraced me as the token, ticks all the boxes of what we're looking for when we're advertising. And I think it was kind of like a win-win situation. So sometimes, it's nice to be able to put a spin on things and, ticking the BAME box or ticking the book of being Muslim, things like that can really also kind of like help with the people that are trying to provide us with that space. So alhamdulillah, I'm really, really grateful and humbled and have a lot of gratitude to those people that are trying to create that space. And again, I was in Wales, and it must have been great for representation that I felt so comfortable enough in my skin in the education center, in the education system, well, at university anyway, higher education. I think the more I embrace my intersectionality, between, again, being a Muslim, and being Black and being a woman, I am very, very, very intentional about the spaces I put myself in. And I say this because I know where I need to be to feel comfortable, open up myself. I know the type of people I want to be around to fully be myself. And it doesn't mean I have to be around people that look like me, but I have to be more, I have to understand that I really do need someone to be compassionate, a bit more open, to be able to feel safe enough to open up myself and share my personality is what I have realized. And again, like the more I embrace my religion, the more I embrace femininity and what comes with, menstrual cycles and, understanding your body and how it works and, different puberties we have to go through. The more I understand being a Black woman, and sometimes people can have certain microaggressions towards you, the more I understand that, the more I am aware of it, the more I'm very intentional about the space I want to be in as a Black Muslim woman. Um, so I think, yeah, it's just about me being a bit more intentional. And also, I give myself a lot of grace, I would say. A lot of the time I would be hard on myself when certain things didn't pan out the way I expected. And I'm the first person to be very critical of myself, but sometimes I've had to actually just accept that the world isn't as kind as it could be, and it could be down to one of these intersectionalities. I think being Muslim and being Black is also very interesting, because sometimes if someone is mistreating you badly, you could be like, is it because of my faith or is it because of my race? When it's someone that's quite ignorant, right? or is it because I'm a woman? And it's like you start to look at like, oh, which part of it? And I realized, it doesn't really matter. It's just that person is very ignorant and needs to get clued up and needs to be able to expand their minds. But it's also that I give myself grace. Like I've tried my best to be authentic. I am a kind person. I know I'm kind. I know I know myself. So I know that when certain things happen that I can't blame myself and it's just the way I am being perceived and I can't control that. Union Wales, things like that. I think that in some cases that my race was more tolerable than my religion, and the way I used to present my headscarf maybe could have, questioned whether I was of the faith because, in African culture, women cover their hair anyway in different styles, protective styles. But I did see the treatment of someone else that was presenting Muslim and maybe Middle Eastern being treated a little bit differently. And, you can almost tell that it is like that bit of like unconscious bias that someone else has towards them. Like, oh, but like again, with me wearing my hairstyle a certain way and maybe my, you know, elite people were quite fascinated by African culture, that almost like overshadowed the possibility that I could be Muslim. So it's actually quite interesting when you think about that and certain things kind of push forward to protect you in a way when you have that intersectionality. So in that case, it was my blackness was pushing forward to protect me from the Islamophobia, which it's like it's not really something that you think about. A lot of it can just be ignorance. People really just genuinely not knowing that I could be Nigerian and black. I've had questions like just from children as well, just asking like, "Oh, where are you from?" Me saying Nigerian and their eyebrows raising like, "But you're wearing the headscarf," and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm Muslim." And then the eyebrows eyebrows raising and jaw drops, thinking, "How is this possible?" And I'm like, "Yes, there are Muslims in Nigeria." Or I've had, I was in London, and like people that stop you in the street tried to talk to you. It was like, "Oh, so when did you convert?" And I was like, "Oh, I didn't convert. I was born into Islam, and I've kept with it because I believe in it." And like, the look on people's faces. So sometimes there's actually that ignorance again from Black culture, especially in the UK, where obviously again Muslims are a minority, Black Muslims are a minority of minority, whereas maybe Black Christians kind of hold more weight, have um, more people.
I think if I ever had a negative experience in educational or healthcare institutions, it was when I was a young girl wearing a hijab. Oftentimes, I remember being very young and being treated in a very dismissive manner by the GP or by teachers at school, whether it was dismissing my pain or not acknowledging I had trouble understanding or not really giving me praise when I had achieved something at school in the same way that other students were given praise. Yeah, on at least 2 occasions I remember my parents having to complain to the GP and to the school because of like because of this such treatment. I also witnessed a lot of Islamophobic comments towards my mum when I was young, when I was just growing up in London. I I did see this less and less growing up, but when I was really young I remember a lot of that. But since I haven't been wearing hijab and not been visibly Muslim, I guess I have felt less discriminated against in institutional settings. I know that when people can visibly perceive your identity, for example, as a black person or as a woman wearing a hijab, your experience in institutional settings can be very different, and the discrimination you face can be worse, as it's easier for people to categorize you and assume things about you based on what they've seen or heard. So since having removed my hijab, I've experienced less of this discrimination. I feel that because people can't easily perceive my identity, they might not know how to act sometimes. So if anything, I sometimes feel slightly unseen or invisible, which is different to how I felt I was treated when I was wearing a hijab.
Thinking from a more holistic lens about lived experiences of people who are at risk of FGM and FGM survivors, we can think about the way they interact with different institutions and their local communities. We all hold several identities at the same time, and they all shape the way we move through the world and are perceived. It's important that we are more accommodating for those who experience different types of inequality and oppression. As organisations working on female genital mutilation, it is important that we do not just look at this practice in a silo, but actually think about the different forms of oppression that survivors and people who are affected by the practice may experience. To ensure we're not leaving anyone behind, it is important that we take into consideration things like race and class and migration status to adequately provide services that really serve affected communities. So on today's episode, we covered intersectionality, what it means, how it relates to FGM, why it's important to think about intersectionality when talking about FGM, and also thinking about survivors and their lived experiences as well. If you are listening to this, I want you to leave this episode really taking away the fact that, similar to just any person you meet on the street, FGM survivors and people who are affected by the practice are incredibly diverse, and to destigmatize FGM and really unlearn some of the harmful stereotypes that you may hold about survivors and affected communities. Thank you for listening, and watch this space as there are more episodes coming. See you soon on the Purple Chair podcast.